Welcome to TecHype, a series that cuts through the hype around emerging technologies to get to what matters. Each episode debunks misunderstandings around emerging tech, provides insight into benefits and risks, and identifies technical and policy strategies to harness the benefits while mitigating the risks of emerging technologies. I'm your host, Brandy Nanaki. Each episode in this series focuses on the hype around emerging technologies. In this episode, we're debunking generative AI. From generating new music hits to designing new medicines, generative AI is blurring the boundaries between human and machine, between creation and imitation. ChatGPT, created by OpenAI, has raised global awareness of generative AI. Its user-friendly interface has given the broader public an opportunity to tinker with this transformative technology, including better understanding its benefits and risks. I'm joined today by Rosie Campbell, who works on AI safety and governance on OpenAI's policy research team. She previously served as head of safety critical AI at the Partnership on AI, where she focused on responsible publication practices for increasingly advanced AI research. Before that, she served as the assistant director of the Center for Human Compatible AI at UC Berkeley. Rosie, thank you so much for joining me today for this episode of TecHype. In every episode, we start off by giving a definition of the emerging technology, and in our discussion, we're talking about generative AI, ChatGPT. What is it?
Yeah, generative AI is a term that's been used a lot recently to refer to the recent advances in machine learning and AI that are specifically focused around generating new content. That could typically be things like images, code, or text, but it has also been applied to things like audio or video. So it can be a whole range of things, really. And it differs from previous generations of machine learning in that previous ones were more focused around classification or prediction rather than this idea of actually generating new content.
ChatGPT really put this in the foreground, and everybody now knows about it through OpenAI, ChatGPT, playing around with text. We just had Elon Musk start up another company, XAI. So we're really seeing a boom in this space. And I think with that, the goal of TecHype is to debunk misunderstandings around emerging technologies. What do you think are the three most common misunderstandings about generative AI?
I would say one of them is just the term generative AI. People seem to think that refers to a new kind of technology itself, whereas I would say it actually applies more to a use case of that technology. The underlying models that are powering these generative AI tools are what's known as large language models or foundation models, and they're very, very general. So as well as doing this kind of content generation stuff, they can also do a lot of the old kind of machine learning things I mentioned around prediction, classification, summarization, data analysis. And that just points to the fact that they are very, very general, whereas previous models had to be trained specifically to do a certain task. These ones kind of learn just from massive amounts of data and can do lots of different things, not just generation, but also these other things. So one of the misconceptions is referring to using generative AI to refer to a technology rather than a set of use cases.
Okay, yeah, that's really interesting. And I think there is a big misunderstanding around what generative AI even is and thinking about the application areas. Later on, when we talk about technology and policy interventions, we're going to talk a little bit about the EU AI Act, which has targeted generative AI systems and their use cases. So I'm excited to dig deeper into that with you. So that's the first misunderstanding about the definition itself. What are two more misunderstandings?
Another one is around the reliability of these systems. A lot of people will talk to ChatGPT and will ask for things like a list of scientific papers on a certain topic. And ChatGPT will generate a list of papers that all sound very plausible. They'll have very convincing sounding titles. Maybe they're by real people that the person's heard of and referencing real journals. But probably that paper doesn't actually exist. And this is what's called hallucination. This is something that language models do all the time. And the reason for that is they are trained on a huge amount of text data. And they're trained to be able to predict the next word, essentially. And that means that they're trying to, given a certain prompt, they're trying to provide a completion to that prompt that sounds plausible based on the kinds of training data it's looked at. That's not actually grounded in any kind of fact or reality. And so it's not being, there's no way to guarantee that it's reliably going to give you factual results. And I think this is one of the problems. People use this technology and trust it much more than they really should, given the limitations of it. Some examples of that I think have been in the media include a teacher who asked ChatGPT if one of their students had used ChatGPT to write an essay, and ChatGPT said yes. But ChatGPT has no idea whether another student used it to write an essay. And the teacher took that as evidence that the student had cheated, which is obviously very unfortunate if that wasn't actually the case.
Yeah, that's extremely problematic. So it performs very well in predicting the next word, what would be likely. Yes. But we should not treat it almost like a search engine where we go and query something and believe that it's going to give us accurate results.
That's right.
Now, I've heard some people, though, are using it as a tool to assist in their writing. To actually correct their writing. And I actually want to give one example to you about this. So I have some coding skills, not great. I can get by a little bit here and there. I'm a ballet dancer, and I wanted to create a pair of point shoes that when I would dance and move the point shoes, it would create the music.
Nice.
Yeah. So I thought, this is my moment. So I bought an Arduino. And it was an IoT Arduino, Internet of Things Arduino. I had a motion sensor, so I hooked it all up. I'd used some initial code that was used where they had a tutorial for a cookie jar. So if you move to the cookie jar and you move the motion sensor, it would tell you, no more cookies today. So I said, okay, let me use that as my base, put the motion sensor on the point shoes, do some of the C++ and Python, to see if I can change it. So instead, when the motion sensor is detected, it plays a beautiful violin sound. And I started to build out my code, and I had some errors. So I put those errors into ChatGPT. And I said, could you please help me correct my error? And it did. It not only corrected it, but it taught me what I had done wrong. So I've actually learned to become a better programmer by using ChatGPT. So I think, along the lines of what you're saying around actually how you can use these tools, there's ways that you can use them. You can use ChatGPT for things like correcting your code or correcting your grammar. But there's also ways where you probably shouldn't be relying on it too much, especially for creating factual information, for example.
I think that's perfectly right. There are limitations to these systems that we need to be aware of, but there are also huge benefits to them, and they can be hugely helpful in assisting people with lots of different tasks, as long as you know what the limitations are and using them correctly. And that actually brings me on to what I think is the third misconception, which is almost the opposite of the previous one. So where some people think that some people have too much trust in these systems, I think there's a flip side of that where people are dismissing these as not intelligent at all in any way because they have some of these limitations. And I actually think that's also a mistake, just kind of in the opposite direction. These systems, as I mentioned, are trained to predict the next word in a sense. And in some cases, you might think, in some cases, it turns out that predicting the next word involves developing very general capabilities. So if you think about something like a mathematical equation, if you want to predict the next word to a mathematical equation, the answer of a mathematical equation, probably the best way to do that is to develop a general understanding of mathematics. So these systems are, in fact, developing quite complex internal representations of different concepts and topics. And so to dismiss these as just stochastic parrots, for example, I think is also somewhat misguided, because they do have these representations and they can be used in ways that are very, very useful and capable and can assist with lots of different tasks. A related issue, I think, is people conflating the idea of consciousness with the idea of intelligence. You might be skeptical that these systems could ever be conscious in the way that humans are, developing some sort of sentience. That's all very well, but I think that doesn't mean that they can't be intelligent in some way, or at least very, very capable at achieving certain goals, achieving certain tasks. And that's also what can lead to them also being dangerous. So I think sometimes people are afraid that the system is going to suddenly wake up and become conscious in the same way as a human is. And some people don't believe that's ever possible. And those people will say, there's nothing to worry about. These systems can never be conscious. Whereas I think that's a mistake, because we should separate out the idea of being conscious from the idea of being intelligent and capable at achieving certain goals and tasks. And I think it's that latter quality that can also make these systems dangerous.
I think that this is such an important point, Rosie. And in an earlier recording of TecHype with Professor Stuart Russell on AI, we talked about artificial general intelligence and what is intelligence. So you making that distinction between consciousness and intelligence, I think is really important to flesh out. So, Rosie, in every episode, we also discuss the benefits and risks of these emerging technologies. What do you think are the greatest benefits and the greatest risks of generative AI systems?
I think one of the really obvious benefits is the fact that it kind of unlocks creativity. One of my favorite parts of my job is just seeing all the amazing things that people are building or producing with these technologies, whether that's art, whether that's code, writing video games, whether it's writing creative stories. Just so much interesting stuff being produced.
Or me even creating ballet bot.
Exactly. I think, that's a great example. It's really lowering the bar to creating things for people who might not have a certain skill set. In the past, if you had an idea and you weren't a skilled artist, it was very, very difficult to bring that idea to life. Now you can use DALL-E, you can use Stable Diffusion, any of these image generation tools, and actually visualize that in a very compelling way.
Yeah, so we can really support greater creativity. Exactly. And I think that's also one of the misunderstandings too, is that we think that these systems are taking away creativity, but when used in an appropriate way, can actually make people more creative.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah,
I think it really kind of widens the pool of people who are able to take part in that creative process.
Okay, so creativity is one of the benefits. Any other benefits?
Yeah, this one, it sounds kind of mundane, but in a way, I think it's one of the most important. I think these tools are just going to really make our lives easier. I already use ChatGPT to help me fill out complicated forms when I don't understand them, or to explain things to me in a way, complicated topics in a way that I will understand. And I think we'll just see more and more these systems being embedded all over the place. And if done responsibly and if done well, that should make things a lot easier. We're already seeing a lot of companies integrate these kinds of tools into websites that they have for customer service purposes, which makes things much easier, I think, than traditional methods. And also, natural language is just a much more intuitive interface to the world than, for example, coding. So I think just in general, we're going to open up the space of making lots of little improvements to the world and to life and making things easier to navigate for people.
Great. Yes. So these benefits sound great. Going to improve creativity, maybe improve some productivity. What are some of the risks?
One of the risks that I think has been getting a lot of attention is the issue of trying to untangle real from synthetic material. I think this is very salient if you think about image generation tools. So yes, it's great that we can now create all sorts of images and photorealistic pictures if we want to. The risk of that is that it can be used to spread, for example, disinformation. It can be used for malicious ends by motivated actors, whether that's politically motivated, financially motivated. And it's becoming harder and harder, I think, to really tell when you see something, whether or not it was, whether it represents something that happened in real life or whether it's just been generated by generative AI. This is not just a problem for something like disinformation. I think we're also going to see a rise in people being scammed, unfortunately. Yes. Synthesizing people's voices and using language models to automate the process of social engineering or phishing attacks, I think is going to be a real problem. And they're sort of narrow examples of a broader problem, which is just the degradation of the information ecosystem and people not being able to tell truth from falsehood very easily. And I am quite nervous about what that's going to do to society and our trust in institutions.
Yeah, I think that this is a really important point. Actually, the very first episode in this season of TecHype, we sit down with Professor Hani Farid to debunk deepfakes. We talk about this. So there are some technical mechanisms that we might be able to put in place, like cryptographic hashing on media that's synthetically generated by a generative AI system, that then would maybe trigger a red flag or some type of warning being put on that material.
Yeah, I'm excited about things like that. There's also, I think there's another challenge when it comes to text data. So while image generation is very obvious how you might use that to create deepfakes, for example, there's also a problem with disinformation when it comes to text and people using it to generate tweets to make it look like there's like grounds support for a candidate or a position or something.
That's a good point.
And that's much harder to have the kind of provenance aspect to it compared to image data. There are some techniques like trying to watermark AI generated text so that you can tell that it was generated by an AI system. But I'm actually not very optimistic about those because a lot of the time we don't just generate a bunch of text and then copy and paste that as it is. People will sort of edit it a bit and will change things. And I'm just not sure these techniques for detecting AI-generated text are actually going to be robust.
And I think I read somewhere that OpenAI is actually trying to develop some of these tools.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about that? How are they doing it?
Yeah.
Are they accurate?
We've tried, so we were talking to the academic community, and obviously one of the concerns there is students using this to cheat on their homework, essentially. And so trying to maintain academic integrity is one of the things that we've been trying to think about. So we did some work trying to develop a tool that would allow this detection of AI-generated content. I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but unfortunately it's not super reliable, accurate. So it's not something that I would say can be relied upon. And I'm also not sure how robust it's going to be in the long term. So I'm really glad that this work is going on, and would encourage lots of people, if you're interested, to think of creative solutions to this problem. But I think we've got a long way to go to solve it.
Yeah, so that's a good call to the academic community and others to invest some research effort into solving this challenge. I really appreciate that. So now that we've discussed some of those benefits around creativity and productivity, and some of the risks around provenance and understanding what is real and what is not, let's dive into some technical and policy strategies that we might be able to implement to better ensure that we can actually reap those benefits and mitigate those risks.
A big focus at OpenAI is on developing technical safety solutions. One example of this is reinforcement learning from human feedback. This is a technique that we developed in order to try and take the base model that we train, which is just kind of digesting a load of data from the internet and can be very sort of unpredictable and say offensive things and be biased in certain ways. And reinforcement learning from human feedback is a technique to try and shape that into something that's actually much more useful, much safer, much more likely to produce outputs that are what we want and appropriate. So, for example, we use that to make our models better at following instructions. So rather than just having to continue a paragraph of text, which is what our old versions of our models did, you can actually give it an instruction like write me a poem or fix this piece of code, and it will follow that instruction more reliably. We also use it for safety purposes. So we will develop guidelines for our human trainers who will train the model to produce more appropriate outputs and to refuse requests that are inappropriate and that kind of thing.
Oh, I love this idea of using reinforcement learning where we're crowdsourcing from individuals about how these models should perform and then tweaking the model to perform in that way. What are some other strategies you think should be implemented?
We also put a lot of effort into our policy approaches. So trying to think about how we can design our usage policies so that they maximize the benefits of technology while also mitigating the risks. This might be disallowing very obviously bad things like illegal activity or malware development, that kind of thing. But sometimes it's a little trickier. Sometimes it revolves around high stakes areas like medicine, like politics, like finance, where if this technology worked very well and was implemented in the right way, you could imagine there being huge benefits to deploying it in these domains. The downside is they're also very risky if it's not implemented correctly or if the limitations of the system get in the way of producing accurate outputs. So, for example, we permit medical use cases with our technology, but we are pretty restrictive when it comes to certain types. So, for example, we don't permit the usage of models to diagnose someone or to generate a treatment plan. And that's because we can't be confident that the model is going to produce accurate information. And in a situation like that, where the stakes are very high and the risk of giving incorrect information could be very harmful, we just don't feel the models are up to fit for purpose, essentially, because of these problems like hallucinations that we discussed.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. But I could see some applications like helping a doctor better communicate with a patient about something.
Yeah.
And then also just to let you in on something I did when I was first playing with ChatGPT. Earlier, I actually asked it to write a debate between President Biden and President Trump about the integrity of the election. And it dutifully spit out a very convincing dialogue from both parties. I wanted to show another colleague. So a few weeks later, I queried the same query again. And that time I got a warning. So there had been a change in policy within OpenAI that now had disallowed me creating a speech for presidents and presidential candidates with a warning that this is dealing with political content?
That's a great point. I mean, we're coming up to the next election cycle, and one of the things we're really concerned about is how our technology is going to be used as part of that. So we're thinking very carefully about what kind of political uses might be beneficial for society, from an educational point of view, for example, and where we think it is going to verge into potentially not being appropriate to use our technology, and trying to update our policies and our systems, our technical systems that do that kind of refusal aspect of it behind the scenes as well.
Yeah. So really important work on, kind of crowdsourcing these ideas from individuals on what should and should not be allowed. And then, making sure you're limiting certain types of queries to make sure that no harm is coming to those who use the technology.
That's right.
So Rosie, you just talked about appropriate usage policies using medical diagnosis as an example of things that you restrict. Do you have any other strategies that should be implemented?
One that I'm working on at the moment that I'm very excited about is what we're calling dangerous capability evaluations. This is all about trying to bring a level of rigor to our risk assessment processes. As we've talked about, there are plenty of risks with this technology. Sometimes they can be quite speculative, especially if we're thinking about not just current systems, but the future versions of these systems and how they might evolve. And so we're really trying to get ahead of the game and trying to predict how these capabilities might evolve and what mitigations we'll need in place. So something we're working on at the moment is trying to develop automated evaluations, which are something that's used quite commonly in the machine learning field in general to measure performance against different metrics or benchmarks. But there hasn't been as much attention for using them for safety purposes. So we're thinking about the kinds of capabilities that we might be worried about. For example, what if ChatGPT becomes really good at persuading people to do things? Or what if these coding tools really make people very good at writing malware or inserting security vulnerabilities into software, things like that? How can we measure that in an automated way so that we're aware of the progression of these capabilities and we can know when we need to make difficult decisions around deployment or building in risk mitigations?
Yeah, and building in those safeguards. Wow, such fascinating work. And I'm certain that there are very interesting conversations happening when you're trying to foreshadow and think about how malicious actors or adversaries might be using this technology in the future. So thank you so much for leading the work on that.
Thank you so much.
Really impactful. So again, thank you, Rosie, so much for joining me today for this episode of TecHype.
Thank you for having me.
Generative AI, including ChatGPT, is transforming the way we work and live. It can be used to unlock creativity, take over mundane tasks, and advance scientific understanding. Yet it simultaneously poses risks of undermining credibility of what's fact from fiction and whether these models are behaving as intended. TecHype was brought to you by the Citrus Policy Lab and the Goldman School of Public Policy at UC Berkeley. Want to better differentiate fact from fiction on other emerging technologies? Check out our other TecHype episodes at techhype.org.